Hey everybody, welcome to Crossroads. I am the Reverend Brian Blair. I'm the priest over at St. Mark's Episcopal Chapel, located here on the campus of UConn. I've got my guest today, newly minted PhD, Jared. Hello, Dr. Jared.
Hi there, Brian. How are you?
Good to see you. Let's do a couple of announcements about some goings on in the community. First of all, of course, you're here at WHUS Stores 91.7, the radio station for UConn. You can follow me at Rev Blair, Blayar, on Twitter. You can get a podcast of the show or download the video of the show at www.revblair.com later on today. Speaking of some stuff that's going on, we've got an organ concert at St. Mark's Episcopal Chapel, 7 p.m. on May 1st, with a wonderful guest, Clara Gerdes. Look her up. Every first Friday of the month, our very own organist does a free recital at noon. So you can bring your lunch, relax, hear a great organ concert, and it's all for free. So come on by St. Mark's for that. In the neighborhood at the Mansfield Library, they've got a book sale on May 4th and 5th. So if you're looking to get some great books for you or your family, head on over to the Mansfield Public Library, May 4th and 5th. There's an organization called the Garden Gate Club, and they are doing a fundraiser for all sorts of things in the community, but in particular for scholarships for students who go to E.O. Smith High School. They're doing a plant sale on May 18th, so look that up. The Garden Gate Club doing a plant sale May 18th for a number of things, but in particular for students who get scholarships over at E.O. Smith. So a lot of great stuff going on in the area and a lot of great stuff going on in the studio. Jared, welcome once again.
Yeah, it's good to be here, Brian.
So this is Crossroads, and on the show we ask our guests every time if they wouldn't mind talking about the intersection of their faith life and their everyday life. How about, if you don't mind, we start with your faith life. Could you describe your faith life to us?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm a Christian. In particular, I'm an Episcopalian. I'm a parishioner at St. Mark's. So,
Oh yeah, that's right.
So you know me fairly well.
Yeah.
But I wasn't always an Episcopalian, or I wasn't always an Anglican. I switch between the two depending on who I'm talking to. I grew up as a Christian. I grew up as a Baptist of the sort of fundamentalist variety, kind that doesn't believe in evolution or anything like that. And eventually, sometime early on in graduate school, a couple years into graduate school, I went through this period where I wasn't really practicing, and I decided I want to sort of give Christianity another shot.
Mm.
And I looked up churches near stores, and because I had no idea what I was doing, and I found this church called St. Mark's. I didn't know what an Episcopalian was. And I saw that there were two services, one at 8 and one at 10. And I decided, hey, you know what? I'll go this Sunday, and I'll go early so that way if it's terrible, I can make the most of my day. And so I went to the 8 a.m. or I guess it was 7:45 back then, and I went there and I loved it. So I've been going to St. Mark's now for I guess about 3 years.
So you're a student at school and you go to church.
Yes.
That's encouraging.
Yeah. So I'm at least I'll be a student for at least another few weeks. This is my last semester here at UConn.
Well, congratulations on that too.
Yeah, thank you
Very
very
nice.
much.
You got your PhD
I got my PhD
in
philosophy.
uh-huh.
My dissertation was on kind of the intersection of some stuff in philosophy of language, including what's going on in linguistics, and also the metaphysics of truth. So my dissertation is in large part just about truth.
Anything you want to share in 2 minutes or less?
You know, I think that if I
About
describe
the metaphysics of truth.
I think if I describe my particular project to anyone who's not a philosopher, it sounds very boring, because the central claim of my dissertation is that truth comes in degrees, which I think to most people who aren't philosophers sounds totally normal. It sounds like common sense. There are things that are more true or less true or half true. But it turns out philosophers for a long time didn't think that was right, and so a big part of my dissertation was trying to sort of argue for a common sense claim in philosophy, which is harder to do than you'd expect.
Well, I don't know. Does common sense and philosophy, do they hold, can you put them in the same sentence?
So there was a whole school of thought called common sense philosophy, and the
Mhm.
idea was you should just start with judgments we think that are totally common sense, and you can build your philosophy out of those. I think that lost favor quite a long time ago, though it's come and gone in the history of philosophy. It's kind of interesting on what the status of common sense. So I didn't rest my case on the fact that it's common sense.
Mm.
Tried to sort of argue. I tried to argue on philosophers' own terms.
Well, that wouldn't go too well, would it?
No.
This is all common sense,
Yeah.
everyone. I'm out of here.
It would have been a very short
Mic
defense, and
drop.
I wouldn't have passed.
Right. We're talking about you just finished up. What's next for you?
Oh, so in a month, I am moving to Austin, Texas, and I'm going to start working at an artificial intelligence company. So they wanted to hire philosophers, particularly philosophers who knew how to formally analyze natural language, and I'm going to be doing that. I'm going to be trying to build better artificial intelligence. Actually, artificial intelligence that can reason with common sense is kind of the whole pitch of this place. So I'm going to be working on that, and the company there does a lot of cool work and a lot of cool contracting, including in healthcare and things. So it feels like a thing where I can try to use some of this education, which I got maybe a bit too much of, use this philosophy and try to make the world a little bit better.
Well, that's interesting that you put it like that, and we're a show about how does your faith life intersect with your everyday life, because now you're into the sort of moral realm, I don't know, of what you plan to do with your life. Was there some sort of an aspect of your faith practice or what you derived from it that went into deciding the choice of this career? And what about as you're engaging in this career?
So I think there was, when I was interviewing for the job, I was asked sort of, why would you want this job?
Mm.
And my answer was very clear. It was like, I want this job insofar as it lets me help people. And if it doesn't let me help people, then I don't want it.
Oh.
And which is I guess a bold move to take if you're interviewing for a job,
Sure.
is to give conditions on
Right.
on taking it. But my new boss seemed very interested in this fact. He's like, this is good. Like, we build this stuff because we want to help people. And I think that part of being a Christian for me is about wanting to make the world better. It's about wanting to help people and meet people where they are and try to help them improve or try to help make their lives easier in a way that I think can be really, really beautiful. I think that the model sort of like for Christians is Jesus, and that the whole model there is a servant leader, right? Like it's someone who can lead, but you lead by helping, you lead by giving yourself up. So it wasn't as if this uniquely determined that I was going to go work in artificial intelligence. That would be crazy. But it made the job seem more appealing. Oh, I can go and do something, and if I can help people, that's great.
It's interesting. We were talking earlier, and you were telling me a bit about your journey towards becoming an Episcopalian Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned your dad, and you mentioned his favorite book in the Bible. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so my dad's favorite book of the Bible is James. And for anyone who kind of knows the inside baseball of this and knows that I said I was raised by like fundamentalist Baptist, and James would not be the book you would typically associate with these Christians. But my dad, from like sort of my earliest memories, talked about James being his favorite book, and James is a book that emphasizes works in your faith, good deeds. Works is sort of Christian shorthand for doing good stuff, right? But it's about, the challenge of James is basically to say, like, you can do all this stuff. You can go to church, you can pray, you can celebrate communion. And then if it turns out that people are starving in your community, you're not really doing it. You're not really, I think James you could argue from James that you can't even be said to actually be worshiping if you're not actually helping people as well.
Mm.
Because worshiping has to come from a place of faith. And faith without works is dead. That's the sort of famous line from James, that we're to care for our brothers and sisters, which for Christians is the entire world.
I hear a lot of that from this Pope.
Yeah.
Almost every time he's in front of a camera or I read a clip in a paper, he seems to be saying a lot of the theology that one might get out of James.
Absolutely. I think it's essential to sort of like a Christian worldview for life. If you want to figure out how to frame yourself, and I think that it was really beneficial to me to hear that as a kid, hear that from my dad on a regular basis. That this was a man who, it's not like all he ever did was go out and like do charitable work or something like this.
Uh-huh.
He had a job, but also he was someone who, he's the kind of guy who reads his Bible every single day, sort of takes a little bit of time, and really had like this like deep faith. But for him, like this deep faith like comes alive. It would be put into practice, and that's where you can really express it. Right? And so, I think also a figure people know less than the current Pope, than Pope Francis, would be presiding Bishop Michael Curry, which.
Well, he got a little famous at the wedding, right?
Yeah, right. And I was actually going to.
know.
That's what I was going to talk about. If you listen to the sermon he gave at the royal wedding,
yeah,
a year, 2 years ago, or something like this, I feel like everyone. It got famous because he talked about "There Is a Balm in Gilead," like that, this famous song. But like, it's a 15-minute sermon, and 12 minutes is about love. But he talks about like what would that be about? Like what would that be like? And he says, a world where we've rediscovered love is a world where no child is hungry, which is a very different kind of love than the sort of sentimental love, that feeling, that emotion. That's love that's like put into practice.
Hey, he talks about this all the time these days. I saw a quote of his pop up, and that's his essential message, which is a good one, I think. We asked a minute ago about like you got a new job. Congratulations, by the way, you're graduating and you have a job, and you graduated with a philosophy degree and you got a job, so that's really good.
Yeah.
But how your Christianity kind of informs how your approach would be to your new job, and you talked about your interview. But you graduated obviously recently with a philosophy degree, and oftentimes I find that religion and philosophy don't necessarily occupy the same space. But you managed to be a practicing Christian and a philosopher, so I was wondering if you could tell us how you managed to reconcile those two things.
Okay, yeah. So I think this is definitely the common sense perception, or the common perception of it, is that philosophy is an arena that is sort of hostile to Christianity, if not personally, then sort of intellectually. That's true to an extent, but there's more to it. So for one, many famous Christians throughout history have been philosophers. Many famous philosophers throughout history have been Christians. And so you have this like rich tradition that you can draw on if you are a Christian who is a philosopher. Thomas Aquinas is like sort of the name you would always say, but there's so many. And I think though for me, what that should tell you, because there have been so many Christian philosophers in history, is that Christianity and philosophy can't be seen as intrinsically opposed to one another. If they were, you'd have some outliers, but you wouldn't have so many. And actually for me, I think that Christianity sort of became more palpable because I was a philosopher. So I was like raised as a Christian, I was baptized as a Christian as a child, but I went through like a prolonged period of doubt, and where I would have openly said, anyone asked me except my parents, I would have said I was an atheist, right? And it wasn't until graduate school, it was my second year here, beginning of my second year here, which was my third year or fourth year in graduate school. So I was in graduate school for 6 years. where I decided to go back to church. And I don't think it's because I became a worse philosopher in those couple of years. Right? Instead, I realized I had sort of accepted a lot of these sort of metaphysical pictures of the world. The world is purely material. It's atoms in a void swirling around each other or something like this. So of course there can't be a God. And I realized the arguments for that in my mind aren't that good. And in fact, I don't think a lot of philosophers ever really explicitly argue for it. It seems kind of like a posit. They'll say something like, well, we have this kind of ontology, we have this metaphysical picture, because it's sort of consistent with the sciences or something. Yes. But I realized it wasn't the only one that was consistent with the sciences, so I didn't feel stupid for thinking that materialism might be false, or something like that. And so this kind of opened up the space, right? The logical space suddenly was broader for me. I started to think that there could be something more. However, it wasn't like I reasoned myself to Christianity. I don't think that ever happens. I don't think there are people who have ever been sort of started from some position and then through a series of good deductive philosophical arguments were like, all right, I think that Jesus of Nazareth was a god. There's just so much of a gap. But honestly, for me, it was like the space had opened, and philosophy sort of actually helped me realize that. It sort of helped me realize. So a line I really like from a famous text in philosophy, from Bertrand Russell's Problems of Philosophy. He talks about the value of philosophy at the end of that book. It's a great book because I teach to a lot of my students as a good introduction. And by the end of it, you say, what's the point? And he says, philosophy teaches you that the world is really weird and surprising. And that it's sort of a mark of the well-educated, thoughtful person that they will not think that the world is going to be like they expect it to be. And if you think like that, if you think that's right, and I do, then suddenly claims that are made in various religions, Christians say things like, we eat the body and blood of God on Sundays. And so I know this tradition better, but other traditions make what seem like crazy, surprising claims, right? Well, if the world is crazy and surprising sometimes, you can't dismiss them just because they're crazy and surprising. And so suddenly I was open to it. I was like, this could be right. Now there's a big gap from there to becoming like a practicing Christian. But it wasn't philosophy that got me there. But philosophy at least got me up to that point.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, well, it cracked the ice a bit, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's interesting. So you don't feel there's an inherent contradiction, obviously, between being a person of faith and being a philosopher?
Not at all, no. I think that it's totally reasonable. And that doesn't mean that I think that all of my particular beliefs, like my religious beliefs, I could give sort of really great arguments for them. But I actually think that most people, including very good philosophers, can't give really good arguments for some of their most foundational beliefs. And because that's not what we're like as human beings. We're not purely reason-giving machines or something like this. So while I don't think that I don't think I can give those kinds of arguments, I also don't think it's irrational to hold them.
Well, you bring up an interesting point. Like you said a phrase, we are not, what was it? We are not purely
reason-giving machines.
Reason-giving machines. Yeah. Do you feel that philosophy in your time studying it leans towards believing that we are? Or do you read people who leave space for the fact that we are not?
So I think that for a lot of people, it's kind of an ideal that we would be purely rational, able to give very good, compelling arguments for all of our beliefs or something like this. But I think that if you reconcile yourself or you try to work through problems associated with like philosophical skepticism or something, you can see that bottoms out eventually. And around the time I decided that I was going to be a practicing Christian again, I was also taking a seminar on skepticism, so maybe this is why I didn't inform so much of it. And there was this guest philosopher, who was a guest professor just for the semester. His name was Duncan Pritchard. And he always talked about Wittgenstein, but was always talking about this one guy who I didn't know at the time, who was an influence on Wittgenstein's thoughts on skepticism. And this guy goes by the name of John Henry Newman.
Oh, this guy, eh?
Which Anglicans should know
Mm.
as being part of like the Anglo-Catholic movement in England. Catholics would know as an Anglican who kept arguing that Anglicans should be more and more Catholic to the point that he decided to convert. But he's a really famous theologian in England, and he had some thoughts. He wrote a book called An Essay on the Grammar of Assent.
Hmm.
And it was basically holding something along the lines of, many of our foundational beliefs, we assent to them, but we're not in a position to give good reasons for them.
Hmm.
So that leaves you with two options. You can either say, well, we're systematically irrational because we can't give good reasons, or it's not a requirement on rationality that you have to be in a position to give good reasons for all of your beliefs.
Hmm.
Since I think that it would be weird if we had a view where every human being was systematically irrational.
Uh-huh.
I think the second part of the dilemma is much nicer, and that's a vast oversimplification of Newman. But you can see that in Newman, and then you can see that going a little bit into Wittgenstein. You can see it in the skepticism class that I took with Duncan Pritchard. You can see it in other people as well. And it's a picture I'm really attracted to.
Well, you use the word skepticism, and we're talking about faith. Do you think that skepticism is necessarily the opposite of faith?
Oh, absolutely not. So I think we have a use of the word skepticism now where people call themselves skeptics, and it's a word that they mean to say that they're atheists, right? Or agnostics. But philosophical skepticism is an inquiry into the justification behind foundational beliefs. And by foundational beliefs, I mean things like, am I massively misled by my senses?
Mm.
Can I know that there's a table here, that I have two hands, that kind of stuff?
No.
You see this in Descartes? Well, that's the thing. Actually, you're probably not in a good position to argue for those conclusions, which is very weird, because you feel like you are. You feel very confident in them.
I know a person who hurt her knee, and she's on a lot of drugs right now,
Mhm.
and she cannot argue that the table is really there.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So she's in a bad position. But the thing is, I actually think you, who you're not on any pain medications or anything like this,
No,
you
I'm
probably
not.
can't argue for it. And I think very good philosophers can't argue for it. It's really hard. Some of the best philosophers in history have been these kinds of skeptics who admit that we are not in a position to be able to argue for these foundational beliefs. David Hume is another famous one that who has a lot of anti-religious conclusions, and yet I find myself very drawn to the way he thinks. I just happen to diverge from him in some places. But skepticism there, as an inquiry into your foundational beliefs, into sort of these basic beliefs that you can build everything else out of, or the things that you take for granted in all parts of your life. That kind of skepticism, thinking about that stuff, that's just part of being human, right? And that can't be inconsistent, I think, with faith. In part because I don't think that. So, I genuinely believe, what it means to be a Christian. I could list out a bunch of stuff, and I would say I believe it. But it's not as if I could, again, give you a super great argument for all of it. I can give you sort of systematically why you should believe some of these and together, why they go together and stuff. But I think there was a leap, right? Kierkegaard talked about this, the leap of faith, and it's there. It's common throughout a lot of thinkers. And there's this leap there, and the question is is that leap unjustified? Well, I happen to think that leap, a leap similar to it, happens when you believe that there are tables and things.
Right, sure.
This sounds like a Pyrrhic victory, right? In the sense of I might have won the battle by saying that faith isn't crazy, but now I've said that everything is. But we could nuance that claim.
Well, how would a conversation like that have gone over when you were younger?
It depends on what age you mean when you say younger.
Well, you talk about having sort of an evolution of faith, or at least of faith practices, right? And so your younger years, the way that you practiced Christianity was different than the way you're practicing it now.
Okay, yeah. So if I had heard this as a kid, I would have thought the world can't work like this. Like, I part of being raised as like a fundamentalist, and by this I mean you have like a very strict literal interpretation of every part of the Bible in a way I now think is like kind of hermeneutically unjustified, blah blah blah. But and you have a lot of like strongly held beliefs about a lot of things. The particular age of the Earth, for instance. And I think that I, at the time, because of how I was raised, mistook confidence and a willingness to like shake off any doubt as having like strong faith in something. I now just don't think that's how it can work, right? If you contemplate the lack of sort of foundations for things, how you view your faith or how you view your beliefs has to change a little bit. You get a little bit of ironic distance between them, which is very weird to say about your faith, right? Because like you should sincerely believe it, and I do. But you also have this kind of like irony to it, where you say, "Well, I couldn't give you a great argument for it." If someone and back in like my youth, my younger days, I would have thought that this just means the world has ended, right? like something something has gone terribly wrong. This would have shaken me quite a bit, and it did, right? So when you have that kind of confidence, and I said I identified as an atheist like when I was a teenager, and one of the reasons was that I thought that it was weird to think that the Earth was 6,000 years old. And so then I was like, well, then it must all be false, right? Because I had been told that you should be confident in all of this stuff, and I now don't believe in like a young Earth. So I'm not a Christian, right? Like that was the leap, right? Because I took it as like this body, and I had found one thing that was wrong, and I look back and say, kind of like, man, I wish I hadn't thought like that. I wish I hadn't gone to such an extreme conclusion. But I also think that it was the natural conclusion to draw if you had this background, if you had this view of what faith was as like unshakable confidence or something. And since I don't think that way anymore, here I am.
That's a great question maybe to pose here on the show. In particular, I use the word faith, and I try to keep it open for the sake of the show. But you're talking about it particularly for you. How would you define faith?
Oh man, yeah. I wish I really knew. I can tell you some things that I think would be insufficient, and that's probably the best I can do. I don't think it's purely intellectual assent, right? It's not purely just like saying, I believe that T, right? Every Sunday, we say the Nicene Creed, right? We say, we believe that, we say a lot of things that we believe. I think that's a component, but it can't be all of it. I think for a long time I thought that was it. It was just about like these sort of purely intellectual propositions. That if you accepted them, you had faith, and if you didn't, you didn't. And I think it's important to believe those things. But I think that faith is, for instance, in some of Paul's letters, is more often compared to hope than it is to belief. And I'm sure someone could go through it and look at the number of times belief and hope are used and prove me wrong. But let's just say it this way. It is often compared to hope. And faith has to have that kind of wishful component to it. When you hope for something, you don't just hope for it with your head. You hope for it with your body and your heart and your soul. You feel it. You have a longing, right?
There's a little something in there about hope is not for something that is seen.
Yeah, and right? Faith is like hope for things that are unseen, right?
You know what? I have no hope or any faith at all in the fact that it is actually 1:30 according to the clock.
Yeah.
And so our time is up. And I think that your ending on that note is a great way to end. I really appreciate it.
All right.
Everyone, we've been talking with Professor Jared Henderson, who has been a great guest. This is WHUS 91.7 Stars. You've been on the radio with me, Reverend Brian Blair. And this has been Crossroads, the show where we ask our guests to talk about the intersection of their everyday life and their faith life. And I really want to thank Jared for being on. Thanks very, very much, Jared.
Thanks a lot, Brian.
This has been great.
Down to the crossroads, drive like a ride. But it seems an old way, everybody passing by. Should you know? I like